Hey guys, our Teal Mask Tournament is underway, and it's our biggest turnout yet. 17 participants total, each with different teams. Let's go over the tournament quickly before diving into each person's team. So the Teal Mask Tournament is our 8th competition, and players spent September team building with access to just the Kitakami Pokedex, excluding the final 5 Pokemon since we felt they would be too powerful and popular. It could have limited how unique a team is, and players may be put at a disadvantage if they didn't choose these powerhouses. In addition to the Pokedex, we also allowed regional forms, evolution lines, and Sinnoh starter lines. This just allowed players more flexibility, and to give players the opportunity to use every new Pokemon available. The 17 players are split into 2 groups. They will battle everyone in their group, and the top 4 from both groups will advance to the winners bracket, while the remaining players would advance to the redemption bracket. From here, battles will be straight knockouts until a winner is decided from both brackets. The winners from both brackets will then battle to see if redemption can be claimed. In the group stages, battles will be double 6v6, so we can really make the most out of every Pokemon. Then when players advance to the winners bracket and the redemption bracket, battles will become doubles 4v4. This is to make battles more strategic and to increase the intensity by making each knockout more impactful. All of these battles will be best of 3, and each knockout is important to distinguish how close each game was. It also helps with the leaderboards to avoid similar scores. Terrestrialization is also allowed. Then as always, Pokemon will be set to level 50 with no duplicate Pokemon or held items. Egg, Tutor and DLC moves are allowed, with no restrictions to EVs, IVs or Natures. On screen you'll see a lot of interesting information that was collected. You can see Ghost, Water and Grass types were very popular, while Psychic was barely used. Out of 102 Pokemon, 27 of them were Monotypes, while 75 were Dual types. Milotic and Sinistra were very popular, used by half of our players. Other interesting choices were things such as Grimmsnarl, Mamoswine and Volbeat. These standout Pokemon were only chosen for one team. It's great to see representation for things such as Dipplin, Maushold and Ribombee. Again, out of 102 Pokemon, 9 can't evolve, 2 are middle stage Pokemon, 52 were 2-stage Pokemon, and 39 were 3-stage Pokemon. In terms of generation, we see Gens 4, 8 and 9 were the most popular groups, with very little representation from Gen 2 and 6. Yet to debut in our tournaments, we see an even mix from each generation. We're almost through every Gen 6 Pokemon, which may happen in the next few tournaments. So today, we'll be going over everyone's team alphabetically over on Mariland.com, and I'll be ranking them out of 10, with the following categories in mind. Each individual category will be ranked out of 10 to get a final average result. Offensive highlights how powerful a team is, with the powerful moves they get access to, and how high the attack and special attack stat is. Defensive looks into how bulky a team is, what kind of moves increase longevity in a game, and how great the defense and special defense stats are. Utility focuses on status moves and the speed stat, how quickly a Pokemon is able to act to hinder an opponent and set up the battlefield to their own advantage. Support will be the overall team synergy and how effective it is at buffing up self and allies. What abilities give you and your team the edge and how safely a Pokemon can switch out to a greater option in the back. Finally, versatility refers to the variety of moves a Pokemon gets access to that aren't just stab moves. If there's a decent mix of physical and special offense and defense, and how the individual Pokemon perform certain roles on a team. So first we have 15 Lapo 9's team, and I've ranked the offense as 6 out of 10. This team does well to almost half of the types. However, with 3 water types, the strategy relies on water offense, and doesn't take advantage of other possible offensive typings. Defensively, I've given the team a 9 out of 10. This is due to the walling nature of the team from things like Mandibuzz, Clodsire and Milotic. There's a lot of resistances on the team too, but this is met with many neutral hits. It may not be super effective damage, but it'll still do decent damage. In terms of utility, there's a lot to play around with. The team can poison the Toxic, paralyse with Thunder Wave, and induce sleep with Hypnosis. Not only can it set up Spikes, Stealth Rocks and Toxic Spikes, but by using Defog, you can clear any traps on your side of the field too, as well as clearing any screens that your opponents have set up. So a solid 8.5 for utility. Speaking of support, the abilities and typings greatly support this team. Prankster Volbeat can quickly support the team, especially with access to Tailwind. Besides that, Unaware Clodsire helps out by ignoring stat changes. Drizzle is just nice weather control and supports the water types, especially if Basculegion has Swift Swim, and competitive would discourage opponents from using Intimidate or lowering stats. 8.5 for this category too. Not perfect, but fairly supportive in many areas. Unfortunately for versatility, I'm going to have to drop it down to 7.5 out of 10. With 3 water types, the team heavily focuses on water, ice and maybe ghost coverage. However, maybe this team is built for the longer games. Rather than getting easy knockouts, the long game is the end result for this team. The roles the Pokemon perform aren't bad by any means, but if the opponent knows what to expect, the team could be easily countered, so hopefully there are some surprises in store for this team. So overall, this team is just shy of an 8 out of 10. You can definitely see how prepped it is for survival with the highest team HP and very respectable special defense. However, that's just about it for this team from just stats alone. I imagine the focus is to stick around and set up traps or status conditions and just cause annoyance for the opponent. so we'll see how far this team can go. Next up, we have a new player in Dragon Slayer, and their team is decent in offense, but it's lacking in the all-out attack department. It gets 7 out of 10 for being more of a defensive team. The damage output is situational, and would rely on maybe setting up first to take full advantage of the Pokemon's offensive abilities. Defensively is much better at 8.5 out of 10, since the Pokemon's stats favour defense a lot more. There are many different resistances and immunities too, which allow the team to survive. 9 out of 10 goes to utility because of the plethora of options available. There's so many status moves this team gets access to that can induce status conditions and stat lowering, while also having great flexibility with screens, trap and weather setup. With support, there are many abilities to take advantage of too. Prankster and Frisk is always great for a team to gain the lead, and with things such as Earth Eater, Thick Fat and Heat Proof, it becomes easier to switch out. So overall, I think an 8.5 out of 10 is suitable. Versatility gets 8 out of 10 because the team does come with various coverage moves. I believe with a well-timed terrestrialization, you can set this team up for success. It may even be beneficial to set up a Trick Room since the team is fairly slow. So in total, Dragon Slayer gets an 8.2 out of 10, which is pretty good for a first tournament team. As mentioned, it has high defense, so much so that it actually exceeds the chart by a single point. However, with great defense comes terrible speed. This team is going to need speed control for an advantage, so hopefully it has a ready waiting strategy. Another newcomer to our tournaments, sporting a completely different team. IGN AP gets 8.5 out of 10 for offense with how amazing the sheer power of the team is. Even the more bulkier options can still do damage, with access to 11 different stab options. Defense only goes down to 8 out of 10 since the times 4 weaknesses leave this team with a few vulnerabilities. However, many of the team members have multiple resistances, meaning it's not all over. The immunities can help out too, especially with switching out. Then we go back up to 8.5 out of 10 with utility, since there are many ways to induce status conditions, and there are different ways to discourage the opponent from attacking or setting up. The speed control is really good too with things like Tailwind and Sticky Web. Not many abilities, which is why we dropped to 7.5 out of 10. Granted, Levitate and Flashfire cover certain weaknesses, but it becomes a game of prediction if you wanted to rely on those for your gameplay. However, Intimidate does help this team to survive some physical attacks. Now in terms of versatility, it's another slow team, which could rely on either Trick Room or Tailwind, or even Sticky Web. Each Pokemon represents a fresh type excluding a double up on ground, and they can be built in many different ways. Therefore, I'm giving this category an 8.5 out of 10, which means this team also gets 8.2 out of 10. These newcomers are definitely bringing some interesting teams, and this one is definitely a mixture of offense and defense. What can we expect from this team during the tournament run? I'ma do this now, and there's enough coverage to check about half the typings if given a stab move and alternative type move. However, the power would depend on the setup and support, seeing how these Pokemon tend to borderline the great power mons, which is why it gets a 7 out of 10. However, with defense, I'm going to rank it an 8 out of 10, since many of these Pokemon are bulkier choices. It has many resistances with a well-rounded defense, and because of the support, it should be bulky enough to set up effectively. Utility sits in the middle of both scores at a 7.5 out of 10. Status conditions can be set up nicely, along with traps. Access to screens is always great to have, and redirection with Follow Me is the cherry on top to really support this team with setting up. Speaking of support, a lot of it will come from Friend Guard, since it can help survive hits you normally wouldn't. Drought and Chlorophyll come hand in hand, while there are fire and poison typings to take on the quad fairy weaknesses. Solid 7 out of 10. So for versatility, the coverage moves are fair, and I imagine it could catch players off who aren't careful. The Pokemon themselves can be built to either play offensively or defensively, which is why I've gone for 7.5 out of 10, especially when there are different typings to get different stab moves. This team is genuinely as standard as they get, which isn't an insult. It's just very flexible and can be used in many ways. It just lacks focus in one area, which makes this team a jack of all trades in that regard, which is why I'm comfortable to rank it a score of just shy of 7.5 out of 10. Jay Sharona has gone for a very aggressive team, almost a 9.5 out of 10. Each Pokemon can deal out massive damage with their wide range of coverage moves. With a powerful mixture of physical and special hitters, this team is capable of getting knockouts under the right conditions. However, even though this team is decently bulky to take hits, you can't ignore the many weaknesses without resistances to cover them. This team is very vulnerable to Flying and Ghost, so 7 out of 10 is the best I can give the defensive nature of this team. Utility shoots up though with many different ways to hinder an opponent. 3 lines of utility easily scores 9 out of 10, since there are several ways to get an advantage in a game, especially if we see a surprise utility move from one of the attackers. Not much support from the typings, so we'll have to shift our attention to the abilities which carries this category. Defiant and Competitive could put an opponent off from lowering stats, and Hospitality just ensures longevity. So I think a healthy 7.5 out of 10 will do here. Versatility, however, gets 8.5 out of 10. There are many coverage move options, which are boosted by the sharpness ability. However, if the attackers aren't attacking, then they may surprise an opponent with their status moves. Again, another amazing team with great mix of physical and special attackers. With all the ups and downs, the average ranking for this team is 8.2 out of 10. Definitely one of the more aggressive teams in terms of stats, so it's just a case of can the opponent survive the hits. Jigsaw is packing some powerful Pokemon options with great attack stats. Lots of different coverage options, and with Rain, all of the water moves coming from this team will be powered up. With all that said, I'm giving offense a solid 8.5 out of 10. 8.5 out of 10 for defense too, since there aren't many weaknesses. The team also has a decent amount of resistances, which can help immensely. Finally, Pokemon are naturally bulky with high defense stats, so they'll be sticking around for a while. 3 in a row of utility, as I'm also giving it an 8.5 out of 10. The team can set up every trap which can cause the opponent issues. It can also set up Light Screen and Reflect while using Defog to clear the opponents. Finally, Redirection and Healing moves allow for survival. For support, Drizzle helps with Water move power and activates Swift Swim too for double speed. Magic Guard may catch out an opponent so they avoid using status moves, but unfortunately, since the typings don't help too much, we'll drop the ranking down to 7 out of 10. The team is fairly versatile with great coverage move options, and with different typings and stats, Pokemon can switch between offense and defense. However, I can only give as much as 8 out of 10, since a lot of the roles on the team are pretty standard. So yeah, Jigsaw gets an 8.1 out of 10 overall, and stat-wise it's looking as average as you can get. The only outlier is a terrible speed, which may have been done on purpose, since the slow and steady could win the race. Kieran is packing a very offensive team that I'll happily give 8.5 out of 10 for. There are many powerful choices that can deal huge damage, and many of the Pokemon have powerful signature moves that can hinder the opponent. Defensively, however, I'm going to have to give a 6.5 out of 10. With the many ghost types, any normal or fighting moves are going to struggle, but that's just as much range as I can give credit for this team. There are many weaknesses that aren't covered greatly by resistances, and the Pokemon are only decently bulky. There are some interesting status moves, however, for a ranking of 7.5 out of 10. Redirection is great for support on the team, and there's a fast Squash, Thunder Wave and Scary Face for speed control. If Mimikyu has any of these moves, then its ability will allow it to set it up for free, which can greatly benefit the team. In terms of support, Hospitality is always useful when it comes to survival, and Defiant will make the opponent feel discouraged to lower their stats. Not to mention Mimikyu's Disguise is one of the best ways to almost guarantee a free setup. It's just with the very limited type support, I'm going to have to drop the ranking down to a 6 out of 10. So at face value, there isn't much surprise factor for this team. We can kind of guess what each Pokemon's role is on the team. There's also a lot of physical attackers on the team, meaning the opponent could wall you if they have physically defensive Pokemon. So I think 7 out of 10 is a decent enough score for this category, which means this team unfortunately gets a 7.1 out of 10 overall. It's very aggressive on the physical department, but that's just about it. The fourth highest speed is noticeable too, so maybe just hitting hard and fast is the way. This team would work really well if your opponent can't respond to the strategy, so only time will tell to see how great it will do. Next up, we have another newcomer, and they have an interesting mix of attackers. Many of the types actually get hit for great super effective damage too, so 7.5 out of 10 seems appropriate, especially with how varied the physical and special options are. On the defensive side, we're looking even better. Many different immunities that complement each other, paired with the multiple resistances to help with reduced damage when switching around. Also, many of the Pokemon are naturally bulky, so I'm going to give defense an 8.5 out of 10. Utility gets 8 out of 10 for basically having many options to play around with. Ally Switch and Follow Me is always great to keep your opponent guessing, and if you do get stuck, then Destiny Bond is there for tough Pokemon that you'd have to deal with. We dropped to 7 out of 10 for support, however. Friend Guard is really useful for survival, if used correctly, and Prankster is just great for setting up screens, hindering your opponents, or just setting up the team better. We get to versatility, and most of the Pokemon have your standard roles if he decides to build it standard. The Pokemon don't necessarily have the best coverage options, and Terrestrializing may be obvious on certain Pokemon. 7 out of 10, let's just move on. 7.6 for this team is probably the most standard when it comes to stats, meaning King Crow is going to have to rely on new entry status, since players won't have any experience of what kind of gameplay he'll be using. Nico next, and we're kicking things off with a solid 8 out of 10 for our offense. There are many offensive typings for strong stab damage, and a great mix of physical and special threats. There's also a lot of coverage potential to hit over half the types for super effective damage. 8 out of 10 for defense too, for plenty of resistances to take hits. The team is vulnerable to water and flying, but it has countermeasures in place for this. Some of the Pokemon are also really bulky, with high defense and special defense stats. A third 8 out of 10, but for utility this time, since there are many options to choose from. Screens help with longevity, and there's plenty of ways to induce status conditions. Memento may also be a fun move to use. The team's support is carried by the typings, but it's not enough for any higher than 6.5 out of 10. Competitive and Prankster are all the support this team gets in terms of abilities, and the typings can only go so far if you plan on switching around a lot. Versatility, however, gets an 8.5 out of 10, since these Pokemon get access to some brilliant coverage moves. Also, they can be built differently to fit a specific role if needed. The stats are interesting to say the least, since it's a relatively fast team, but doesn't shine anywhere else. Overall, it's 7.8 out of 10, and I've got to say, I'm intrigued to see what each individual Pokemon is capable of doing in this format. Moving on to Spider-Mark 86, we see a fairly neutral team when it comes to offense, which is why I've given it a 7.5 out of 10. It definitely isn't the most aggressive team, but in theory, it should do well against over half the typings. It just comes down to what moves are chosen for each opponent. Defensively though, the typings are capable of resisting plenty of types, and the Pokemon themselves have higher defense stats, so they should be able to stick around longer in a battle. Also, since it's only vulnerable to fire, ghost and flying, I'm going to rank the team a 9 out of 10. Utility is dropping back down to 7 out of 10, since there's a decent selection of moves to use. There are moves that will help reduce the opponent's damage, and there's even speed control with Tailwind and Trick Room. There's a lot of abilities and typings that support this team, which is why I'm ranking it 8 out of 10. Competitive and Defiant deter stat drops, and Snow Warning can stop other weather teams with the bonus of Aurora Veil. With Versatility, I'm giving it a respectable 7.5 out of 10. There's plenty of coverage moves to surprise the opponent, but the roles on the team are fairly straightforward. It will come down to trustalizing, and hopefully the opponent won't be able to predict which terror option you've gone for. So overall, this team gets a 7.8 out of 10. It's definitely a marked team. I know it's going to cause any player problems, especially if they're hitting on the special side. It'll just come down to what strategies are on show. Another newcomer, who is currently our dark horse for TVR tournaments, Theo Flare brings an interesting rain team that'll help with water moves, and with enough coverage to provide a challenge. Since it could come down to signature moves, however, I'm going to have to give offense 7 out of 10. On the other hand, defense gets an 8.5 out of 10. The immunities are decent enough to catch an opponent out, and the Pokemon themselves are already naturally bulky. Let's just hope the opponent doesn't come packing electric and grass moves. Now, the utility this team gets is similar to previous teams, so an 8 out of 10 seems fitting. For the standard access of Tailwind and Trick Room for speed control, help in hand is usually helpful, and screen supports is rarely a bad thing to have. Speaking of support, another 8 out of 10, since the abilities and typings are pretty useful. The standard Drizzle Swift Swing combination is incredible, and Prankster gives the team access to quick support. The 3 water types help out with the ice and fire weaknesses too. Remember when I said that Theo Flare is currently our dark horse? Well, just because I've ranked Versatility a 7.5 out of 10 doesn't mean surprises aren't in store. I've given it this ranking due to the lack of experience we've had with this player, so it all depends on how he plays this team. Therefore, this team gets 7.8 out of 10 overall, and my word is the special attack high. Given the right setup, this team could actually deal out massive damage. We'll see how prepped this team is when the gameplay comes. We're almost there now, I swear. Why not consider subscribing if you watch these kind of videos frequently? It would really mean a lot, and it would definitely support the channel. It's completely free, and it literally takes less than a second. So if you want to join the TVI squad, just click that button. Let's continue by covering another newcomer in Prime Tails. His team is very different from the rest, and in theory should hit half the types for super effective damage. Since there are many different types too, there's definitely a lot of offensive pressure. So with all that, plus a nice little split between the attack and special attack, the category gets an 8 out of 10. However, the team is vulnerable to fire, flying and rock, so I'm bringing defensive capabilities to 7 out of 10. It does, however, have a decent amount of resistances and nice level of immunities to quad resists. There are a ton of utility moves to cover, so to keep it simple, I'm giving this category a 9 out of 10. Skill Swap and Worry Seed could shut down opponents relying on abilities. Using any of the traps available can hinder the momentum too. So for support, I couldn't find much. The typings were below average for switching around, so that's got to be about a 4 out of 10. I've bumped it up to 6 out of 10 however, since it does have Prankster, which is amazing for quick support, and Intimidate is always handy to reduce the opponent's attack power. For versatility, I'm giving the team a 7 out of 10. There's limited access to coverage moves, and an interesting mix of physical and special attackers. Besides that, the roles on the team may be straightforward, if it goes for the standard setup, so the stats for this team are all over the place. The team itself gets a 7.4 out of 10, and is the fastest team by numbers alone. The attacks are average, and the defense is below average, so I'm intrigued to see what this team is capable of doing. Sarah's team has many powerful Pokemon with high attack stats. I imagine they could one-shot Pokemon with ease, especially with how insane the coverage is available. Having access to Sun and Snow would definitely enable more powerful moves, so we're starting off with a healthy 8.5 out of 10. For defensive, I'm also going to have to give it an 8.5 out of 10. There's a solid mix of really bulky Pokemon, but there are some that are frail too. There's a decent amount of resistances, and even though there are a few weak points, there are countermeasures in place for them. Loads of utility moves with this team, so 9 out of 10 is a given. There's plenty of options to choose from. She can induce status conditions, lower stats where possible, and play the game to benefit her. Basically, there's many different ways to get the advantage. For support, we're looking at 9 out of 10, which I bumped up from 8 since the more I thought about it, the more I realised the support is actually very influential to both her team and how it affects the opponent. Double weather access can be played in many ways, and typings can actually lead to some comfortable switch-ins. The team can play a few roles depending on the opponent. It'll either work really well or won't work in the slightest. The team has a wide range of moves to choose from, and with a well-timed terrestrialization could prove devastating. That's why I'm going to go for an 8.5 out of 10. So a promising team from Sarah that gets an overall ranking of 8.7 out of 10. It's incredibly fast, and if used correctly could be a massive threat to the competition. Hopefully we see some great things from this team. Here we have my team, and it has a great mix of physical and special attackers. There's a lot of types these Pokemon can cover, and there are some powerful Pokemon choices, so I think it will get an 8.5 out of 10 for offense. The team has bulky options with high defenses, with decent resistances and many immunities. The only really vulnerability I have is fighting, so if I'm able to avoid that I should be fine. So for defense, I'm giving it an 8.5 out of 10. However, things go downhill with utility, and the ranking drops down to 6.5 out of 10. There's a decent range to choose from with different ways to lower stats. I've pointed out Whirlwind though, since it's a niche move that could help with unwanted matchups. For support, I'm going for 8.5 out of 10. As mentioned before, Defiant and Competitive could be used to catch opponents out who tried to lower stats. Snow boosts the Ice Pokemon defences and helps out with Snow Cloak. Since the team is vulnerable to fighting, it's nice to know there's at least a Ghost type to switch into. 8 out of 10 goes to Versatility, since the Terra options could be difficult to predict. There are many different coverage moves to choose from, and because of the many typings on the team, it works really well for offense and defense. So this team gets the overall ranking of 8.1 out of 10. It's the second best team in terms of stats, and it makes sense with the incredibly high special defense and above average HP, attack and defense. I'm confident in this team, but whether it'll perform well is another story, so fingers crossed. Coming in with a mix of powerful attackers, we have Wizzy, who I've ranked 7.5 out of 10 for offense, since some of the typings do overlap, so some of the matchups may be challenging. I think it will come down to how the signature moves play their part in the game. Now, because some of the typings overlap, we do see a lot of weaknesses making the team vulnerable in some areas, not to mention the abundance of neutral hits. However, at least the Pokemon are bulky enough to at least take a few hits, rewarding this category a 7 out of 10. Utility gets 8 out of 10 due to the hazards being useful, and Taunt could come in handy. Speed control can also be managed with Paralysis, Scary Face and Trick Room. There's also a lot of moves in general that can control the match, like Hypnosis and Strep Sap. Support also gets 8 out of 10, since Hospitality, Prankster and Competitive give the advantages I've mentioned many times before. We could even see Super Sweet Syrup having some play by lowering the opponent's evasiveness, allowing powerful, inaccurate moves to hit. Finally, for the team's versatility, I've decided on 7.5 out of 10, since there are a decent amount of moves for coverage. It's just unfortunate how some of these Pokemon roles are standard, and would be a huge surprise if they deviated from these roles. So from the second highest base stat total to the third, we see Wizzy's team achieve a 7.6 out of 10. Wizzy can manage battles really well, with a great bulky team. This bulky team has really high attack and special attack potential. I can definitely see this team performing really well, and I hope to face it in my run. The penultimate team comes from Wolfie222, our last newcomer to cover. It's difficult to tell how this team will do, since the team has varied typings for different stab options, and a nice mix of naturally offensive Pokemon, so I've decided to give it a 7.5 out of 10 for offense. For defense, I bumped it up to 8 out of 10 due to the Pokemon also being naturally defensive. The team doesn't have any huge weak points, meaning that it isn't vulnerable in any particular type, which is pretty awesome when you think about it. Utility gets 9 out of 10, since there's too many status moves to go over, and I don't really want to discuss strategies that I've already covered. I will say though, that with access to Belly Drum and Shell Smash, this team can set up like mad and deal out some massive damage. So for support, Healer is an interesting ability that can support status conditions, which has a niche on a team. Magic Bounce can also help out with deterring the opponent from using status moves. Solid 8 out of 10 for this category. So Terra options for this team aren't obvious, and can be flexible since there are many coverage moves this team can take advantage of. As a result, I'm going to give Versatility an 8.5 out of 10. It's not your standard team, especially for this format, which may actually be an advantage. So overall, Wolfie's team gets an 8.3 out of 10, which isn't bad for a first tournament team. It shines in every stat besides speed, and with such unusual choices, I can't wait to see what kind of strategies this team is hiding. And finally, we reached the last team to go over, and what better way to end it off than with Zeke Crates, our on again off again participant, making a comeback after a lengthy hiatus. Anyway, offensively it's 8.5 out of 10, for the reasons listed on screen. Defensively, it's not looking too bad either, at 8 out of 10. Zeke is known for surviving hits, and with this team I can definitely see the Pokemon living on red health when you least expect it. There are decent options to choose from with utility moves too, both to set up or cause issues for the opponent. I can definitely see this team getting the edge, which is why I've given it an 8 out of 10 for this category. Slowly moving up to 8.5 out of 10 now with support. There are many great abilities to gain an advantage, and the Pokemon typings are pretty situational if he decides to switch around. So the team has many options for physical and special offense, and the roles on the team can vary and change on the fly. Each Pokemon has many coverage options too, to keep the opponent guessing, which is why Versatility gets an easy 9 out of 10. So it does seem we've saved the best team till last. This team stat-wise is the best overall, and ranked 8.4 out of 10 to boot. Highest attack, and just shy of having the highest special attack too. If it weren't for the lackluster speed, this team would be busted just from the stats alone. However, this is Zeke we're talking about, so of course there's more to this team than just numbers. We'll just have to wait and find out during the tournament. So on screen now is every team's final ranking. This is just a guideline to how I've personally ranked them from the 5 categories stated at the start of this video. This isn't a say all mean all, and the results may not even reflect these rankings. I just personally feel that each team from what I've seen are around these rankings, and I can imagine they will perform on a similar level. So good luck to everyone taking part in this tournament. It's been a blast as always going over your teams. I can't wait to see which 8 advance and who will win it all. I think this format is definitely interesting, considering in Sword and Shield we did a similar thing with the Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra. So one can only imagine that the Indigo Disc DLC will have its own tournament featured in the future. With enough channel support, I can definitely look into doing a sequel video to this, but with the other DLC. But for now, let me know your thoughts on all these teams in the comments below. Until next time, train hard, team build to the best of your abilities, and I'll see you all in the next video.